the crimson puddle expanding across the pristine linoleum of St. Jude's loading dock belonged to Chicago's most ruthless ghost. Alice Higgins, an overworked, plus-size triage nurse, drowning in student debt, should have called hospital security. She should have run. Instead, she pressed her bare hands into the bullet wound of a mafia kingpin. That single, frantic choice sealed her fate. And now, the underworld's most dangerous predator absolutely refuses to let her go. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a maddening, relentless hum. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday at St. Jude's Medical Center in downtown Chicago, the absolute dead zone of the graveyard shift. Alice Higgins was currently running on 3 hours of sleep, 2 stale powdered donuts, and a dangerously large iced coffee from the 24-hour drive-thru on Michigan Avenue. Being a plus-size woman in a high-intensity nursing job meant her body was constantly under scrutiny, but her stamina was unmatched. While the resident doctors were dozing in the break room and her fellow nurse, Brenda, was catching up on reality TV at the front desk, Alice was restocking the trauma bays. That was when she heard the screech of tires. It wasn't the heavy, mechanical groan of an ambulance. It was the sharp, aggressive squeal of performance tires burning rubber on the wet asphalt of the ambulance bay. She dropped the stack of saline bags she was holding and rushed toward the double doors. A sleek, black, heavily tinted SUV, an armored Cadillac Escalade, judging by the reinforced door frames, slammed into park. Before the vehicle even fully stopped, the back doors flew open. 2 men in tailored, dark suits dragged a third man out. "Get a gurney now," one of the men roared. He had a thick Italian-American accent, his eyes wild and desperate. Alice didn't hesitate. Training took over. She kicked the brake release on a nearby stretcher and shoved it out the sliding glass doors into the freezing Chicago wind. "Lift him on 3, she commanded, not caring that these men looked like they could snap her neck with 2 fingers. 1, 2, 3. They dumped him onto the mattress. The man was massive, at least 6'3", with broad shoulders that strained against his ruined, blood-soaked dress shirt. His face was pale, his jawline sharp and clenched in absolute agony. Dark hair fell over his forehead, slick with cold sweat. "What happened?" Alice barked, grabbing the rails and pulling the heavy stretcher inside. He caught 2 in the abdomen. "High caliber." "Don't ask questions, sweetheart. Just fix him," the second man growled, stepping into the glaring light of the ER. She noticed the unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster beneath his blazer. "I need a name and blood type," Alice demanded, ignoring his weapon. "And don't call me sweetheart." "Leo, O negative," the first man said. His name was Matteo, she would later learn. He handed her a wad of cash. $100 bills stained with crimson. "No paperwork, no cops. You keep him off the books, or we burn this hospital to the ground. Keep your money." Alice snapped, tossing the bills onto the counter. Brenda, page doctor. Miller, trauma bay 1, massive hemorrhage. She wheeled Leo into the trauma bay and grabbed a pair of trauma shears, slicing his ruined Prada shirt straight down the middle. His chest was covered in dark ink. Intricate tattoos sprawling across thick muscle. But her eyes locked onto the 2 puncture wounds on his right side, just below the rib cage. Blood was pulsing out in a terrifying rhythmic flow. Arterial bleeding. "He's crashing," Alice muttered to herself, grabbing a stack of gauze and pressing down with all her body weight. Because of her size, she could put substantial leverage into the pressure, locking her elbows and leaning hard into the wound. Suddenly, a massive, blood-slicked hand shot out and gripped her wrist like a vice. She gasped, looking down. Leo's eyes were open. They were a piercing, terrifying shade of amber, like a wolf caught in the headlights. Despite the massive blood loss, his grip was iron tight. "Don't! Stop!" he rasped, his voice a gravelly, low baritone that vibrated through the chaotic room. "I'm not going anywhere, tough guy." "Keep your eyes open," she told him, matching his intense gaze. "Look at me. What's your favorite color?" "What?" he coughed, a fine mist of blood spraying his lips. "Keep talking to me. What's your favorite color?" she yelled, leaning harder into his abdomen. "Green," he grunted, his eyes dropping to the emerald green scrubs she was wearing. "Like you." Dr. Miller burst through the doors, looking disheveled, but snapping his gloves on. "What do we have, Alice?" 2 GSWs to the right upper quadrant. Suspicion of hepatic artery laceration. He's O negative. BP is dropping. Heart rate is 130. She rattled off, not breaking eye contact with Leo. "All right. Let's get him to the OR immediately. Alice, you keep that pressure on until we have him on the table." "Ride the gurney, doctor," Miller ordered. Alice climbed up onto the edge of the stretcher, her knees sinking into the mattress beside his hips, maintaining the heavy, life-saving pressure as the orderlies sprinted them toward the surgical elevators. Leo never let go of her wrist. Even as the anesthesia began to hit him in the OR, his thumb weakly stroked the pulse point on her arm. "Green," he whispered one last time before his amber eyes rolled back. She stayed in the scrub room for an hour, covered in his blood, staring at the wall. The men in suits had vanished. The money was gone from the triage desk. By the time her shift ended at 7:00 a.m., there was no record of a Leo in the hospital system. It was as if the ghost of the underworld had simply evaporated into the Chicago mist. But she could still feel the bruising grip of his fingers on her skin. 4 days later, the adrenaline of that night had entirely faded, replaced by the crushing reality of her existence. Alice lived in Pilsen, in a cramped, third-floor walk-up apartment that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and damp drywall. Her landlord, Mr. Henderson, was a sleazy man who liked to look at her with hungry, calculating eyes whenever she was late on rent, which was often. Rent was due on the first, Alice, Henderson sneered, leaning against her doorframe on a gloomy Friday afternoon. She had just woken up from a post-shift nap. "I told you, I get paid on Tuesday. You'll have it then, plus the late fee," she said, pulling her oversized cardigan tighter around her body. "Maybe we can work something out," he suggested, taking a step into her apartment, his eyes raking over her curves in a way that made her skin crawl. Before she could threaten him with the pepper spray she kept on the console table, a heavy, leather-gloved hand clamped down on Henderson's shoulder. "The lady said Tuesday," A cold voice echoed in the hallway. Henderson spun around, his face draining of color. Standing there was Mateo, the panicked man from the hospital. He looked completely different now. Composed, terrifying, wearing a charcoal three-piece suit. Behind him stood two other men, built like brick walls. "Who the hell are you?" Henderson squeaked. Mateo didn't answer. He simply shoved Henderson backward, with a force that sent the landlord stumbling down the stairs, scrambling to his feet, and sprinting out of the building without looking back. Mateo turned his attention to her. "Alice Higgins. How do you know my name?" she demanded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "How did you find me? When you save the boss's life, we tend to do our homework," Mateo said smoothly, stepping into her apartment uninvited. He glanced around at her thrifted furniture and the stack of past due bills on her kitchen counter. "Pack a bag. You're coming with us." "Excuse me, I most certainly am not." Alice planted her feet, crossing her arms over her chest. She wasn't some tiny, fragile girl who could be easily intimidated. She stood her ground, her stature giving her a sense of solid, immovable defiance. "I have a shift at St. Jude's tonight. You need to leave." "Mr. Castellano insists," Mateo said, dropping a bombshell. "Castellano. Leo Castellano. The head of the Castellano crime family. The syndicate that ran the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in Illinois." The realization hit her like a physical blow. The bleeding man on her stretcher was the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld. "I don't care if he's the Pope. I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her bravado. Mateo sighed, reaching into his breast pocket. He pulled out an iPad and tapped the screen, turning it toward her. It was security footage from the hospital loading dock. It showed the rival gang. "The Antonelli crew," Mateo explained, bribing a hospital security guard to get the tapes. "They saw your face, Alice. They know you're the one who kept him alive long enough to get to surgery. By saving Leo, you made an enemy of the Antonellis. You aren't safe here. In fact, if we hadn't been watching your building for the last 3 days, you would already be dead." A cold sweat broke out on her neck. "Watching me? Leo is out of the hospital. He discharged himself against medical advice because the hospital isn't secure. His incisions are infected. He needs a private live-in nurse. He requested you, exclusively." Mateo stepped closer, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You can come willingly and be compensated more in a month than you make in 5 years at St. Jude's, or I can throw you over my shoulder and carry you to the car. Your choice." Alice looked around her dingy apartment. She looked at the eviction warning on the fridge. She thought about the Antonelli cartel hunting her down. "I have conditions," she said, her voice hardening. Mateo raised an eyebrow. "Name them." "I bring my own medical supplies. I get a private room with a lock on the door. And if he dies on my watch, you don't shoot the messenger." Mateo actually smirked. "Deal. Get your things." An hour later, Alice was sitting in the back of an armored Maybach, speeding toward the Gold Coast, Chicago's most affluent and exclusive neighborhood. The transition from her grimy street in Pilsen to the towering glass high-rises overlooking Lake Michigan was jarring. They pulled into a private underground garage, heavily guarded by men holding submachine guns under their coats. She was escorted into a private elevator that required retinal scans to operate. The doors opened directly into a penthouse that took her breath away. It was a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling windows, dark mahogany wood, and Italian leather. The city sparkled below them like a sea of crushed diamonds. "He's in the master suite," Matteo said, pointing down a long, dimly lit hallway. "Good luck. He's not in a good mood." Alice tightened her grip on her medical bag. She was a professional. She had dealt with belligerent drunks, violent addicts, and arrogant surgeons. A grumpy mafia boss wasn't going to break her. She pushed open the heavy oak doors to the master bedroom. It was massive, smelling of expensive sandalwood and copper. The unmistakable scent of blood. Leo Castellanos was propped up against a mountain of black silk pillows in a king-sized bed. He was shirtless, thick bandages wrapping around his heavily tattooed torso. His skin was pale, bathed in a sickly sheen of sweat, but his amber eyes were sharp, locking onto her the second she entered the room. "You took your sweet time, nurse," he rasped, his voice low and dangerous. "Traffic was awful, Mr. Castellano. Plus, I had to pack my entire life into a suitcase because your goons dragged me out of my home." She shot back, walking straight to his bedside and dropping her bag on a glass side table. He chuckled, a dark rumbling sound that ended in a sharp wince of pain. "You have a smart mouth. I remembered that about you." "Let's see the damage," Alice ordered, snapping on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. She didn't wait for his permission. She reached out and gently peeled back the edge of his dressing. The surgical wounds were inflamed, angry red at the edges, and warm to the touch. The start of a serious infection. "You're an idiot for leaving the hospital," she told him, fetching antiseptic and fresh gauze from her bag. "I leave my life in the hands of strangers. I end up in a body bag," Leo said, his eyes tracing her face, then slowly dragging down her body. It wasn't the sleazy look her landlord gave her. It was calculating, intense, and surprisingly, appreciative. "I trust you. You didn't run when you had the chance. I was doing my job. You were meant to be mine," he murmured, the fever making his words heavy and possessive. "I told Matteo, only you, the green-eyed angel. My eyes are brown, Leo, and I'm wearing a gray sweater," she replied dryly, dabbing the antiseptic onto his wound. He flinched, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist, exactly like he had in the trauma bay. The heat radiating from his skin was alarming. "Don't get smart with me, Alice. Then don't get infected on my watch, boss." The next 2 weeks were a grueling test of wills. Leo Castellano was the most stubborn, demanding, and infuriating patient Alice had ever encountered. He refused pain medication because it dulled his senses, insisted on taking phone calls with his capos while she was trying to change his IVs, and constantly tested her boundaries. But underneath the mafia kingpin exterior, there was an undeniable magnetic pull between them. Living in the penthouse was like living in a high-tech fortress. Alice had her own luxurious suite, a chef who cooked anything she desired, and unrestricted access to a massive library. But she was not allowed to leave. The Antonelli threat was still active. She was a bird in a very dangerous, gilded cage. One evening, Leo's private physician, Dr. Gallagher, paid a house call to check on her progress. Gallagher was a thin, elitist man who looked at Alice like she was something scraped off the bottom of his shoe. "Her wound care is adequate, Doctor," Gallagher sneered, checking Leo's chart while she stood in the corner of the master bedroom. "Though I'm surprised you requested a nurse of her proportions, Leo. Normally, you prefer more aesthetic company." The insult hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Her cheeks burned. She was used to microaggressions about her weight, but having it weaponized in front of Leo stung more than she cared to admit. She looked down, biting her lip to keep from snapping back. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The ambient temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Leo, who had been resting with his eyes closed, snapped them open. He pushed himself up, ignoring the strain on his healing abdomen. "What did you just say?" Leo's voice was deadly quiet. It wasn't a yell. It was a lethal promise. Dr. Gallagher swallowed hard, adjusting his glasses. "I merely meant, Mr. Castellano, that she doesn't fit the usual profile of." "Get out," Leo commanded softly. "Leo, I need to check your—" I said, "Get the hell out of my house," Leo roared, the sheer volume rattling the crystal glasses on the nightstand. Matteo materialized in the doorway instantly. "Escort the doctor out," Leo growled, his amber eyes blazing with murderous intent. "And if he ever speaks to Alice, or looks at her with anything less than absolute reverence again, remove his tongue. Are we clear?" "Crystal, boss," Matteo said, gripping the terrified doctor by the arm and dragging him out of the room. Silence fell over the master suite, save for Leo's heavy breathing. Alice stood frozen in the corner, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. No one had ever defended her like that. Not ever. Men usually looked past her, or used her size as a punchline. Leo Castellano had just threatened a man with mutilation for insulting her body. "Come here," Leo ordered, his voice softening just a fraction, though the dangerous edge remained. She walked slowly to the edge of his bed, her hands trembling slightly. "You shouldn't have elevated your heart rate like that. You'll pop a stitch." He reached out, his large, warm hand wrapping around her waist. He didn't pull away when he felt the softness of her curves. Instead, he pulled her closer, burying his face in her stomach, his arm locking her securely against him. "You are beautiful," he murmured against her sweater, his breath hot through the fabric. "Every inch of you. Don't let a worm like Gallagher make you doubt that for a second." She placed a hesitant hand in his dark, thick hair. It felt incredibly intimate, dangerously domestic. "Leo, I'm your nurse. We can't do this." He tilted his head back, looking up at her. The fever was gone, replaced by a burning, lucid obsession. "You ceased to be just my nurse the moment you moved into my home, Alice. You're under my protection now. You are mine." Before she could process the possessive weight of his words, the deafening sound of shattering glass tore through the penthouse. Alarms shrieked instantly, blaring in red, flashing strobes. The floor-to-ceiling window in the adjacent living room had just been blown inward. Gunfire. Automatic gunfire. "Get down," Leo shouted, tackling her to the floor. His massive body covered hers completely. As bullets ripped through the drywall above their heads, shredding the headboard where he had been resting seconds before. The Antonellis had found them, and the gilded cage was breaking wide open. Deafening bursts of automatic gunfire tore through the pristine silence of the master suite, turning the sanctuary into a lethal meat grinder. Drywall exploded into powdery white dust. Expensive crystal lamps shattered, raining razor-sharp shards across the Persian rug. The sheer concussive force of the assault vibrated through the floorboards, but all Alice could feel was the crushing, unyielding weight of Leo Castellano shielding her body with his own. He didn't hesitate. He hadn't scrambled for a weapon or dived for cover alone. His first instinct, his only instinct, was to throw his massive, healing frame over her. "Keep your head down, Alice." Leo roared over the relentless pop, pop, pop of heavy caliber rounds chewing through the walls. "Your stitches," she screamed back, pressing her face into the floor as a bullet obliterated the mahogany nightstand 3 feet away. "Leo, you're bleeding." She could feel a warm, sticky dampness soaking through the front of his shirt, pressing against her shoulder. The sudden, violent exertion had definitely torn his abdominal sutures. Before Leo could respond, the heavy oak doors of the bedroom were kicked open. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the final, fatal shot. But the voice that boomed through the chaos belonged to Matteo. "Boss, clear the lane." "Moving in," Matteo shouted. He was flanked by 2 guards wielding matte black assault rifles, laying down a punishing, suppressive fire into the living room, pinning the attackers down. The air instantly grew thick with the acrid, metallic stench of cordite and burnt gunpowder. Leo grabbed her collar, hauling her up into a crouch with surprising strength for a man actively hemorrhaging. "We move now. Stay attached to my hip, understand? Do not let go of me." "Where are we going?" she gasped, her chest heaving, the adrenaline making her hands shake violently. "Panic room, go." They scuttled across the floor in a low crawl, dodging the sweeping beams of laser sights cutting through the dust. Matteo and his men formed a human barricade behind them, trading brutal, deafening volleys with the Antonelli hit squad. The sheer scale of the betrayal struck Alice in a flash of terrifying clarity. This wasn't a random drive-by. You don't just casually stroll into a biometric-secured Gold Coast penthouse. Someone on the inside had sold the Underworld king out. Leo shoved her into his massive walk-in closet, slamming his bloodied hand against a hidden keypad behind a row of custom Italian suits. The back wall hissed, sliding open to reveal a steel-reinforced elevator. "Get in," he commanded, practically throwing her inside before turning back to the bedroom. "Matteo, fall back." Matteo and 1 surviving guard sprinted into the closet just as a grenade detonated in the living room, the shockwave knocking them all off their feet. The reinforced steel doors of the elevator clamped shut just as a hail of bullets pinged harmlessly against the exterior. The elevator began a rapid, stomach-dropping descent. The sudden silence inside the steel box was ringing, broken only by their ragged breathing and the horrifying wet sound of Leo collapsing against the back wall. "Leo!" She scrambled toward him, sliding on her knees. His face had gone chalk white, a stark contrast to his dark hair and amber eyes, which were now glazed with pain. "I'm fine," he grunted, though his hand was clamped over his right side, blood seeping aggressively between his fingers. "You are a terrible liar," she snapped, the triage nurse in her completely overriding her fear of the mafia boss. She grabbed his wrists and forcibly pulled his hands away. The pristine white bandages she had applied hours ago were saturated in deep crimson. "Boss, they hit the underground garage," Matteo said grimly, checking the security feed on his phone. "They bypassed O'Rourke's security detail completely. This is an inside job. Victor Antonelli must have bought off the night shift. If O'Rourke is dirty, I want him breathing when I find him. I'll peel his skin off myself," Leo wheezed, his jaw clenched in absolute fury. "Is the backup transport secure?" "Yes. The armored decoy is waiting in the sub-basement. We're going to Lake Geneva." The elevator ground to a halt. They were 3 levels beneath the Chicago streets. Alice stripped off her cardigan and balled it up, pressing it brutally hard against Leo's bleeding side. He let out a sharp, guttural hiss. "I warned you not to get your heart rate up," she muttered, her hands slick with his blood. "You're a harsh woman, Alice," he panted, a dark, dangerous smile pulling at his lips despite the agony. "I think I like it." Matteo hauled Leo up by his good side, and they practically carried the boss to a waiting matte black SUV hidden behind a concrete pillar. They piled into the back, and the driver hit the gas, sending them tearing out of a hidden service tunnel into the rainy Chicago night. She kept the pressure on Leo's side for the entire 2-hour drive north toward the Wisconsin border. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his head resting heavy against her chest. In the dim light of the speeding SUV, with a mafia kingpin bleeding in her arms, Alice realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't just a hostage anymore. She was actively keeping him alive, and God help her, she didn't want him to die. The Lake Geneva safe house wasn't a dilapidated cabin in the woods. It was a sprawling, brutalist fortress made of concrete, glass, and steel, hidden deep within 50 acres of private forest. By the time they arrived, Leo was burning with a fresh fever, his body rejecting the trauma of the torn stitches and massive exertion. The guards carried him into a makeshift medical bay in the basement. It was stocked better than her ER at St. Jude's, complete with surgical lights, oxygen tanks, and a sterilization autoclave. "Everyone out," Alice ordered, snapping on a fresh pair of gloves and ripping open a sterile suture kit. "I need to stay with him," Matteo argued, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Unless you know how to perform a layered fascial closure." "Matteo, you are just taking up my oxygen. Get out, secure the perimeter, and let me do my job," she shouted, the exhaustion and adrenaline finally boiling over. Matteo blinked, clearly unused to being barked at by anyone other than Leo. He looked at his boss. Leo, pale and sweating on the surgical table, gave a weak, dismissive wave of his hand. Matteo nodded respectfully and stepped out, locking the heavy steel door behind him. For the next 2 hours, it was just her, the glaring overhead lights, and the broken body of Chicago's most feared man. She administered a local anesthetic. He still refused general sedation and went to work. She carefully cleaned the torn tissue, clamped a minor bleeder that had ruptured, and began the tedious process of resuturing the muscle wall and skin. He didn't make a sound. His amber eyes remained fixed on her face, tracking every micro-expression, every bead of sweat that rolled down her temple. It was unnerving. "You stare too much," she murmured, tying off the final knot and snipping the thread. "I'm committing you to memory," Leo replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "In case I don't make it. You're not going to die from a torn stitch, drama queen. You're just going to have an uglier scar," she said, grabbing a warm, wet towel to clean the dried blood from his chest. As she dragged the towel over his heavily tattooed skin, tracing the intricate lines of ink that covered his pectorals and stomach, her hand slowed. She was acutely aware of the hard muscle beneath her fingertips, the slow, rhythmic thud of his heart. Suddenly, his large hand shot out, capturing her wrist, not tightly like he had in the hospital, but with a firm, deliberate gentleness. "Why did you protect me today, Alice?" he asked, his gaze piercing straight through her professional armor. "When the shooting started, you didn't run for the door. You grabbed onto me." She faltered, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't look away from those wolf-like eyes. "You were protecting me. It's basic human decency. In my world, there is no decency. There is only loyalty and betrayal," Leo said, his thumb slowly brushing against her pulse point. It was racing. "I have men who have sworn blood oaths to me, who eat at my table, who just sold me out to Victor Antonelli for a briefcase of cash. Yet you, a woman I dragged from her home against her will, fought to keep me breathing. I'm a nurse, Leo. I preserve life. Stop hiding behind the scrubs," he challenged softly, pulling her hand down to rest flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. "You feel that? It beats for you now." The confession hung in the sterile air, heavy and suffocating. Her heart did a violent flip. She had spent her entire life feeling invisible, constantly trying to shrink herself, apologizing for taking up space. But Leo didn't look at her like shy was something to tolerate. He looked at her like she was an absolute necessity, like she was oxygen. "Leo, you're high on adrenaline and blood loss," she whispered, trying to pull her hand away, but his grip remained steadfast. "I am a plus-size girl from Pilsen who can barely pay rent. You are a billionaire crime boss. Whatever this is, it doesn't work. It's a trauma bond. It's a mistake." Leo's eyes darkened, a flash of genuine anger sparking in his gaze. He pulled her forcefully toward him until their faces were inches apart. The scent of sandalwood, sweat, and danger was intoxicating. "Never insult my intelligence by telling me what I feel, Alice," he growled softly, his breath fanning across her lips. "I don't care where you're from. I don't care about your rent. And if one more person brings up your size as if it's a flaw, I will bury them under the foundation of this house. You are magnificent. You are fierce. And you are mine. I knew it the second you told me not to die in that trauma bay. Before she could formulate a defense against the overwhelming intensity of his words, a heavy knock echoed against the steel door. "Boss," Mateo's muffled voice called out. "We found him." Leo's expression shifted instantly from possessive lover to ruthless predator. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by an arctic, calculating chill. He released her wrist and sat up, ignoring her hiss of protest as his fresh stitches pulled tight. "Bring him in," Leo commanded. The door swung open, and Mateo dragged a bloody, bruised man into the room, throwing him onto the tile floor. It was Arthur O'Rourke, the head of Leo's security detail, the man who had sold them out to the Antonellis. O'Rourke was sobbing, blood pouring from a broken nose. "Mr. Castellano, please. They took my wife." Victor Antonelli said he'd kill her if I didn't disable the perimeter alarms. I had no choice. Alice took a step back, horrifyingly aware that she was suddenly standing inside a mafia execution chamber. The reality of Leo's world crashed down on her, shattering the fragile, romantic bubble they had just built. Leo slowly swung his legs over the side of the surgical table. He didn't look angry. He looked hollow, completely detached from human empathy. He walked over to the supply tray, picked up a steel surgical scalpel she had just used, and looked down at the traitor. "Alice," Leo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Turn around and cover your ears." "Leo, no," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Don't do this." He was trying to save his family. Leo paused, turning his head to look at her. The conflict in his eyes was palpable. He was a monster who ruled through fear and violence. But she was asking him to be a man. "He almost got you killed, Alice," Leo said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "For that alone, he deserves to be carved into pieces." "If you do this in front of me," she said, standing her ground, her hands balled into fists to hide her shaking, "you prove you're exactly the monster everyone says you are, and I will never look at you the same way again." The silence in the room was absolute. Mateo shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor. O'Rourke whimpered on the tiles. For 10 agonizing seconds, Leo Castellano, the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, stared down the barrel of her ultimatum. Then, with a loud, metallic clatter, he dropped the scalp spool onto the stainless steel tray. "Mateo," Leo said, never breaking eye contact with her, "take him to the basement. Break his legs. Ban him from Chicago. If I ever see his face again, I'll finish the job." "Yes, boss," Mateo said, hauling the weeping man out of the room. When the door clicked shut, Leo leaned heavily against the table, exhausted. He looked at her, completely vulnerable, stripped of his armor. "I spared him for you," Leo confessed, his voice ragged. "I let a traitor live. It goes against everything I am, everything that keeps me alive." She walked over to him, the fear melting into an overwhelming, terrifying affection. She wrapped her arms around his waist, avoiding his wounds, and buried her face in his chest. He immediately wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, holding her like she was his anchor in a raging storm. "You saved his life," she whispered. "No, Alice," Leo murmured, kissing the top of her head, his grip tightening protectively. "You're saving mine." Winter slammed into Lake Geneva with brutal, unforgiving force, freezing the massive body of water into a sheet of solid, opaque glass. Inside the concrete walls of the Castellano safe house, however, a different kind of storm was brewing. 2 weeks had passed since the ambush at the Gold Coast penthouse. 2 weeks of isolation, intense physical therapy, and an agonizingly slow erosion of the professional boundary she had tried so desperately to maintain. Leo was healing. His body, a roadmap of violent encounters and underworld survival, was resilient. As his strength returned, so did his overwhelming magnetic presence. He no longer spent his days confined to the basement medical bay. Instead, he commandeered the massive, open-plan living room, overlooking the frozen lake, running his criminal empire through encrypted laptops and burner phones, and he refused to let her leave his sight. "You're pacing, Alice. You're going to wear a groove into the concrete," Leo remarked one afternoon, not looking up from a ledger Matteo had just handed him. He was wearing a dark cashmere sweater that stretched taut across his broad shoulders, looking every bit the ruthless billionaire. "I'm going stir-crazy, Leo," she admitted, crossing her arms over her chest. She was wearing a pair of expensive silk pajamas that he had specifically ordered for her. They draped perfectly over her curves, tailored to fit her plus-size frame, with a reverence she had never experienced from a clothing brand before. "I haven't breathed fresh air in 14 days. I feel like a ghost." He closed the laptop with a soft click. The sheer authority in that single movement caused Matteo and the 2 guards in the room to immediately step outside, closing the heavy mahogany doors behind them. They were alone. Leo stood up, walking toward her with a slow, deliberate prowl. The limp in his step was almost entirely gone. He stopped mere inches away, his amber eyes dropping to take in the way the silk clung to her waist and hips. "You are the furthest thing from a ghost," he murmured, reaching out to tuck a stray curl behind her ear. His touch was scorching, a stark contrast to the freezing winds rattling the reinforced glass windows. "You are the most vibrant, substantial thing in my entire world. But if you need air, we will get you air. I can't just go outside, Leo. Victor Antonelli is still looking for us." "Victor Antonelli is a dead man walking," Leo stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "He just doesn't know it yet. My men have dismantled 3 of his warehouses in the last 48 hours. We are choking his supply lines. He will make a desperate move soon, and when he does, I will take his head." The casual violence of his words sent a shiver down her spine, but to her absolute horror, it wasn't a shiver of fear. It was anticipation. The underworld was bleeding into her soul, corrupting her nightingale pledge. She was falling in love with a monster. Before she could respond, a shrill, jarring ringtone pierced the quiet room. It wasn't one of Leo's encrypted business phones. It was a cheap, disposable burner resting on the coffee table. The only people who possessed that number were supposed to be dead or entirely off the grid. Leo's jaw tightened. He picked it up, hitting the speakerphone button. "Speak." Castellano, a raspy, sickeningly cheerful voice echoed through the speaker. "Victor Antonelli, I hear you're enjoying the snow up north. Must be nice. Hiding behind reinforced steel while your empire burns in Chicago. My empire is fine, Victor, but your docks seem to be experiencing some severe combustion issues, Leo replied, his tone conversational, though his free hand balled into a lethal fist. Victor chuckled, a wet, grating sound. You always were an arrogant bastard, but I figured out how to bring you out of hibernation. Turns out, your little green-eyed nurse left some loose ends at St. Jude's. Her blood ran cold. The air in her lungs vanished. Say hello, Brenda, Victor coaxed. A muffled, terrified sob crackled over the line. Alice, please? I don't know what they want. They grabbed me in the parking garage. Shut her up. Victor snapped in the background, followed by the sickening sound of a backhand strike and Brenda's sharp scream. Don't you touch her, she screamed, lunging for the phone. But Leo caught her waist, pulling her hard against his chest to restrain her. Listen to me very carefully, Victor. Leo's voice dropped an octave, vibrating with demonic rage. If you damage a single hair on that woman's head, I won't just kill you. I will eradicate your entire bloodline. I will wipe the name Antonelli from the earth. Big words from a man in hiding, Victor sneered. Tonight, midnight, the old Navy Pier shipping yards, warehouse 4. You come alone, and you bring the nurse. We trade the girls. If you bring your army, or if you don't show, I'll send Brenda back to St. Jude's in several different biohazard bags. Tick-tock, Leo. The line went dead. She ripped herself out of Leo's grip, her hands trembling violently as she backed away. Tears stung her eyes. Brenda. Oh my God. Brenda has a 4-year-old daughter, Leo. She has a daughter. This is my fault. Because I saved you, she's going to die. No one is going to die tonight except Victor Antonelli, Leo said, his amber eyes burning with a terrifying, apocalyptic fire. He hit a button on his smartwatch. Matteo, assemble the strike team. We're going to war. He said to come alone. She panicked, grabbing his arm. He'll kill her if he sees your men. Leo grabbed her face in both of his massive hands, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. The sheer, overwhelming power of his gaze anchored her spiraling panic. Do I look like a man who plays by the rules of a dead cartel boss? Leo asked, his voice a low, soothing rumble that contrasted wildly with his murderous intent. I am the king of this city, Alice, and tonight I am going to show you exactly why. You are going to get dressed. You are going to stand by my side, and we are going to bring your friend home. The Chicago skyline was a jagged silhouette against the pitch-black, starless night. The old Navy Pier shipping yards were a desolate wasteland of rusted shipping containers, broken asphalt, and decaying brick warehouses. The freezing wind whipped off Lake Michigan, biting through the heavy wool of the designer overcoat Leo had draped over her shoulders. Alice was sitting in the passenger seat of an armored SUV, parked 2 blocks away from Warehouse 4. The engine was off. The interior was pitch black, save for the faint green glow of the tactical monitors. Matteo was operating in the back seat. Thermal imaging shows 15 heat signatures inside the warehouse. Matteo whispered into his headset, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Victor is in the center. He's got the hostage tied to a chair. Snipers are in position on the adjacent silos. Strike Team Alpha is stacked at the loading bay doors. Leo was sitting in the driver's seat, loading a high-capacity magazine into a sleek, customized submachine gun. He was dressed entirely in black tactical gear, Kevlar strapped tightly over his healing abdomen. He looked like the Grim Reaper incarnate. He racked the slide of the weapon, the metallic clack sounding deafening in the quiet cab. Then he turned to Alice. "You stay in this vehicle. The doors are locked. The glass can withstand a point-blank blast from a shotgun," Leo commanded, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek. His thumb brushed over her bottom lip. "If something goes wrong, Matteo has orders to drive you straight to a private airstrip. A jet is waiting to take you to a villa in Sicily. You will never have to worry about money or safety again." "Nothing is going to go wrong," she said, her voice shaking, but her gaze unwavering. She reached up and covered his hand with hers. "You promised to bring her back. You promised to come back to me. I am a man of my word, Alice." He leaned across the console and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, reassuring kiss. It was bruised, desperate, and fiercely possessive, a brand on her soul claiming her as his. When he pulled away, his eyes were wild. "Watch the monitors. Watch what happens to men who threaten what is mine." Leo opened the door and stepped out into the freezing wind, melting instantly into the shadows of the shipping yard. For the next 10 minutes, the silence was absolute torture. She stared unblinking at the thermal monitors in the back seat. She saw the green cluster of dots representing Antonelli's men. She saw the single dot that was Brenda. And then she saw a solitary, massive heat signature walk straight through the front doors of Warehouse 4. "Leo, he's in," Matteo breathed. Inside the warehouse, a microphone hidden on Leo's tactical vest broadcast the audio directly into their SUV. "Castellano!" Victor Antonelli's voice echoed, tinged with a nervous tremor. "I told you to bring the nurse. The nurse is untouchable, Victor." Leo's voice was deathly calm, echoing through the cavernous space. "But I brought myself. Let the St. Jude's girl go, and I'll let you choose the caliber of the bullet I put in your skull." "Arrogant to the end," Victor shouted. "Kill him! Executu," Leo said softly. The ensuing chaos was catastrophic. Through the headset, the deafening roar of synchronized sniper fire erupted. On the thermal monitor, 6 of Antonelli's men instantly dropped to the ground, their heat signatures fading. Before the surviving thugs could even raise their weapons, the loading bay doors blew completely off their hinges in a massive blast of C4. Strike Team Alpha flooded the building. The gunfire was a relentless, rolling thunder. Target secured. Hostages shielded. A voice barked over the tactical comms. "Hold fire! Hold fire!" Leo roared, his voice cutting through the bloodbath. The shooting abruptly stopped. "Matteo, bring the car up," Leo ordered over the comms. Her heart hammered against her ribs as Matteo scrambled into the driver's seat, throwing the massive SUV into drive and tearing down the broken asphalt. They smashed through a chain-link fence, the armored grille absorbing the impact like it was paper, and screeched to a halt inside the sprawling, smoke-filled warehouse. The scene was a slaughterhouse. Bodies in Antonelli, colors littered the concrete floor. Castellano operatives, heavily armed and masked, stood in a tight perimeter. In the center of the room, Brenda was sobbing hysterically, covered by a tactical blanket, unharmed. And 10 feet away from her, Victor Antonelli was on his knees. His legs had been shattered by rifle fire. He was bleeding profusely, staring up in absolute terror at Leo, who stood over him like a conquering god. She pushed open the heavy door of the SUV and stepped out into the corded-choked air. "Alice, get back in the car," Matteo yelled, but she ignored him. She walked straight past the dead bodies, straight past the heavily armed mafia soldiers who parted for her like the Red Sea. She walked until she was standing right beside Leo. Victor looked up at her, coughing blood onto his chin. You're just a fat bitch in scrubs. You caused all this." Leo didn't say a word. He didn't blink. He simply raised his weapon and drove the butt of the heavy rifle violently into Victor's jaw, shattering bone and silencing him instantly. Leo dropped the weapon, letting it hang by its tactical sling, and turned his back on the bleeding cartel boss. He looked down at her, his chest heaving, his hands coated in the ash and blood of his enemies. He was waiting for her to run. He was waiting for the reality of his monstrous world to finally break her spirit. Instead, she reached out and gently wiped a smear of soot from his cheek. "You got her back," she whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, silent warehouse. "I told you," Leo said, his voice dropping into a ragged, reverent whisper. "I am the king, but a king is nothing without his queen." He reached into his tactical vest, pulling out an incredibly heavy, breathtakingly beautiful diamond ring that caught the harsh glare of the warehouse halogens. It wasn't a proposal. It was a coronation. He didn't drop to one knee. Mafia bosses don't kneel for anyone. Instead, he took her left hand, his grip steady and unyielding, and slid the massive diamond onto her ring finger. It fit perfectly. "You saved my life in that hospital, Alice. Now you own it. You own me, you own this city, and you own anyone who ever dared to make you feel like you were less than royalty." She looked at the ring, then up into the amber eyes of the most dangerous man in Chicago. The terrified, overworked triage nurse from Pilsen was dead. She had died the moment she pressed her hands into a kingpin's bleeding chest. In her place stood the untouchable matriarch of the Castellano family. "Take me home, Leo," she said softly, intertwining her fingers with his. Leo smiled, a dark, victorious, terrifying smile. He pulled her against his armored chest, kissing her deeply amidst the smoke and ruin of his enemies. Behind them, Matteo raised his pistol to Victor Antonelli's head, and as the final gunshot rang out in the warehouse, sealing their absolute victory, she knew one thing for certain. The Underworld was entirely theirs. Thank you so much for diving into this dark, thrilling mafia romance. If you loved the intense chemistry, the brutal loyalty, and Alice's journey from an overworked nurse to the undisputed queen of the Underworld, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance junkies and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, heart-pounding stories of dangerous men and falling hopelessly in love. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite twist and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on our next wild ride.